I was 23 when this happened, and at the time, I didn't think of myself as someone who got scared easily. I grew up in Oregon, spent most of my life hiking, camping, and working seasonal jobs in the mountains. So when my cousin asked if I wanted to watch over his small cabin for a week while he traveled, it felt like nothing out of the ordinary. Just a quiet place in the woods, a few hours outside town with steady cell service and enough space for me to work on a couple of online classes. The drive up was normal. It was early afternoon, clear sky, cold enough that I kept the heater on, but nothing unusual. The cabin wasn't isolated in the way horror movies show. There were other cabins around, just spaced out enough that you wouldn't see people unless you went looking for them. I remember thinking it would be a nice break from everything.
No crowded apartments. No loud neighbors.
Just a week to myself. When I arrived, everything looked exactly the way my cousin described. The cabin was small and simple. One bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room with old wooden floors that creaked when you stepped too hard. The kind of place people used for short weekends, not long stays. He told me to expect some noise at night because the place was old, and I didn't think much of it. I put my bag down, opened the windows to let some fresh air in, and settled in like it was any other normal day. For the first few hours, I treated it like home. I made coffee, walked around outside, and checked the shed to make sure everything was locked up. It was normal, quiet, peaceful, and honestly relaxing. Even when I walked around the property, everything felt safe. The trail behind the cabin was covered with pine needles and the air smelled clean. There wasn't a single moment that felt strange or dangerous, except for one small thing. When I first stepped inside, I noticed the front door didn't feel right. It closed, but not smoothly, like it had been forced or slammed too hard at some point. The bottom corner dragged slightly against the floor. I figured the wood must have swollen from the weather. That's common with older cabins. But when I walked around and checked the back door, I realized it had the same issue. The latch looked newer than the door, and the frame had a crack running down the side, like someone had tried to pry it open. At the time, I brushed it off. I told myself it was probably from a storm, or maybe the last renters were rough with it. Still, something about it stuck with me. I remember holding the back door for a second longer than I needed to, feeling the slight wiggle in the hinges, and telling myself it wasn't worth thinking about. But even then, on a normal, calm afternoon, something in my gut told me those doors didn't break on their own. And the more I looked at them, the more I felt like someone had tried to get inside. Or maybe someone had tried to keep something inside from getting out. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. And looking back, I wish I had taken that feeling more seriously. The cabin sat about 30 minutes off the main road, tucked between tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. Even during the day, it always felt a little dim around the property, like the trees held the light back. It wasn't isolated to the point of danger, though. A few other cabins sat along the same dirt lane, spaced out just far enough to give everyone privacy, but close enough that you could hear a neighbor's dog bark at night. The closest one was maybe 100 yards through the trees. It was the middle of October, and the air had that cold, dry feeling that comes right before winter. Most of the seasonal renters had already closed their cabins for the year, which meant the whole area was quieter than usual. You could walk outside and hear nothing but the wind pushing through the branches and the occasional crack of something dropping from a tree. Honestly, before everything happened, it felt peaceful. The kind of quiet you don't get living near a city. My cousin, Mark, had asked me to stay there while he went to Colorado for a work assignment. He didn't like leaving the place empty for too long. Break-ins weren't common in the area, but he'd had someone steal tools from his shed 2 years back. He figured having someone stay a week would keep everything safe. I didn't mind helping. I wasn't working full-time yet, just doing online classes and part-time deliveries, so taking a week away felt like a break. I had a few reasons for saying yes. I needed somewhere quiet to catch up on assignments, and I wanted some time away from people. My roommate had friends over constantly, and our apartment walls were thin. The cabin felt like the opposite of that life. Solid walls, no traffic noise, nothing demanding my attention every few minutes. Just space to breathe. The first day went smoothly. I unpacked, cleaned up the counters, and walked the property to make sure the doors and windows were in good shape. Mark left me a list of simple tasks to handle. Keep the firewood dry, make sure the pipes didn't freeze at night, and check on a neighbor's cabin once midweek. Nothing complicated. There weren't many other characters involved in that first part of the week. The only nearby person I interacted with was an older man named Gary, who lived in one of the cabins farther up the lane. I saw him twice, both times while he was loading firewood into his truck. He gave me a small wave, and that was it. He wasn't the talkative type. Inside the cabin, everything felt normal. The fridge worked. The water heater kicked on without problems. The place had a slight old wood smell that you stopped noticing after an hour. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table and watched the light fade earlier than I expected. By 6, the whole place looked darker than it should have, even with the lamps on. Nothing seemed threatening. Nothing felt out of place. It was just me, a small cabin, and a quiet week ahead. At least, that's what I thought. The first small thing happened on my second night. It was around 9 p.m., and I was sitting at the kitchen table finishing an assignment. The cabin was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge and the faint wind outside. At some point, I heard a light tapping sound coming from the hallway, 3 soft taps, spaced out, almost cautious. I didn't think much of it. Old houses make noise. Wood shifts. Pipes knock. I told myself it was nothing, and went back to typing. But then it happened again, this time a little louder. Not a creak or a pop, more like something brushing lightly against the wall. I walked over and checked the hallway. Nothing was there. The floor was empty, the bathroom door was open just like I left it, and the bedroom door was shut. The whole hallway felt still and quiet in a way that made me aware of my own breathing. I stood there for a few seconds, listening, waiting for another sound. Nothing came, so I went back to my work and tried to shake the feeling. Later that night, around 11, I heard something else. It was a soft thump, like a light footstep, coming from the area near the bedroom. Not heavy, just enough weight to make the floor give a little. I paused what I was doing and listened again. The cabin settled a lot in the cold, but this felt too deliberate, like pressure being applied slowly, not wood expanding. I walked to the bedroom and opened the door. It was dark, but nothing looked disturbed. I flipped on the light, checked the corners, even looked under the bed. Nothing. Still, something felt off. The air in the bedroom had a different temperature, a slight chill compared to the rest of the cabin, as if the window had been open earlier. But it was locked. I tested it twice. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the quiet sense that something had moved inside the cabin without me hearing it clearly. Not in a dramatic way, just a small shift where something wasn't meant to shift. The next morning, when I walked into the living room, I noticed the throw blanket on the couch was on the floor. I hadn't touched it since the day I arrived. I picked it up, confused, trying to remember if maybe I'd knocked it off without noticing. But the blanket was folded before. Now it was crumpled, like someone sat on it or kicked it aside. Again, small but strange. Around noon, I heard what sounded like a faint cough from outside the kitchen window. A single, low exhale. I looked out expecting to see Gary or maybe a hiker on the trail, but there was no one. The yard was still, the trees weren't moving, and the silence afterward felt heavier than before. By the time evening came, I caught myself checking over my shoulder more than usual. There wasn't any clear reason to be nervous. Nothing had happened that I could point to and call dangerous. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like someone else was there, quiet, careful, and close enough to hear every step I took. By the third night, the tension wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't a feeling or a guess. It was something I could point to, something physical. It started right after dinner. I stepped onto the small porch to throw out some food scraps when I noticed footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. At first I thought they were mine, but the stride was longer and the shape looked different. The prints pointed directly toward the cabin wall, stopping right under the kitchen window. They weren't there earlier. I crouched down and looked closer. The prints faced the house, not the trail. The dirt around them looked recently disturbed, like someone had been standing there for a while, long enough to press down deep. A cold feeling ran through me, but I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe a neighbor walked by. Maybe it was Gary checking something. But the prints didn't continue anywhere else. They just ended there at the kitchen window, like someone walked up, stood still, and then backed away carefully enough that the return steps didn't show. I went back inside and locked the door immediately. That night, the sounds returned. Only this time they weren't small. Around 11 p.m., while I was in the living room trying to focus on a movie, I heard a slow dragging sound along the side of the cabin. Not scratches, more like fabric brushing against the wood. It moved steadily, inching its way from the back door toward the porch. I muted the TV and listened, barely breathing. The sound stopped right below the front window. I didn't get up. I didn't look. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the dark glass. I knew I wouldn't be able to see anything from inside. The reflection of the room's lights made the window a black mirror. And the idea of walking forward, knowing someone might be inches away on the other side, made my stomach twist. I turned off the lamps one by one and sat in the dark for a moment. I thought maybe I could catch whoever it was outside, but another part of me didn't want to know. The silence felt heavy, like the cabin was holding its breath with me. Then something else happened. Something that made it clear I wasn't imagining any of this. The back door rattled. Not violently. Just a single, slow turn of the knob. A test. Someone trying to feel out how much give the lock had. The old hinge creaked under the pressure. I stood up, heart pounding, and grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a fireplace poker leaning by the stove. For a few seconds, the knob stopped moving. Then it turned again.
A little harder this time.
I backed into the hallway, keeping my eyes on the door, ready to run into the bedroom and lock myself in if it swung open. My mind kept racing through possibilities. Was it a drifter, a neighbor, a thief? None of those thoughts made the situation feel safer. The rattling stopped. The cabin went dead silent. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. I didn't hear anyone walking around. It felt like the person had simply waited right outside, listening to me move inside the house. That was the first moment I truly felt trapped. And I knew whoever was out there wasn't going away. I barely slept after hearing the back door rattle, so by the time the fourth night came around, my nerves were already stretched thin. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, even if it meant disappointing my cousin. But that night, I didn't even make it to morning. It started just after midnight. I was lying in bed, wide awake, listening to the wind push against the trees. Then I heard a sound I hadn't heard before, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, but steady. Someone walking with purpose. The boards creaked under the weight, and the footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. I sat up immediately, heart pounding so hard it felt like it shook the mattress. I knew I needed to call the police, but when I grabbed my phone, the screen showed one bar flickering. The call wouldn't connect. I tried 3 times before giving up and putting the phone down. That's when the knocking started. Not loud, not frantic, just a slow, controlled tap. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. The kind of knock someone uses when they're in no rush, when they know you're inside and know you can't ignore them. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the blanket like it could protect me. Then the knob turned. Not testing this time. Turning like someone was ready to walk in. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the fireplace poker again. The door hinge groaned as the pressure increased, and the wood frame made a soft cracking sound, like it was only a few seconds from giving way. I backed down the hallway toward the bedroom and shut myself inside, locking the door.
I
Shoved the small dresser in front of it, even though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined. My breath felt sharp and uneven, and my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the poker. I stood there in the dark, waiting, listening. Then I heard the front door finally give. It didn't smash open. It just popped, like the lock broke clean and the door swung inward. The air pressure shifted through the hallway, letting me know the cabin wasn't sealed anymore. Whoever was there stepped inside. I heard the slow tread of boots on the living room floor. 1 step. Another. Then a pause.
like he was listening for me.
The sound of the refrigerator humming felt deafening in the silence. I covered my mouth to keep from breathing too loud. My legs were shaking so badly, I thought I might collapse before anything happened. Then the footsteps moved again, closer, heavier, deliberate. They reached the hallway entrance and stopped. I could picture him standing there, deciding which door I was behind. Suddenly, the bedroom doorknob twitched.
Once. Twice.
Then it turned fully. The dresser held for a moment, but he shoved it hard, pushing the door an inch open. I could see a thin slice of hallway through the crack. Just darkness and the edge of a boot. I made a decision without thinking. I lunged at the open window. I forced it up, grabbed the frame, and climbed out into the freezing night air, scraping my leg on the sill. Behind me, the dresser slid another inch, wood grinding against wood. I hit the ground and ran. Not toward the road. Not toward the trail. I sprinted straight into the trees, branches whipping my face, my breath loud in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him coming out of the cabin after me. And the sound of those footsteps hitting the porch will stay with me forever. When I ran into the woods that night, all I cared about was getting as much distance as possible between me and the cabin. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing where the moonlight actually touched the ground. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were about to collapse, and my hands were raw from grabbing branches just to stay upright. I finally managed to call 911. The signal was weak, and the call kept cutting out, but the dispatcher understood enough. She told me to stay where I was and keep talking until officers reached the road. It took almost 20 minutes before I saw the faint flash of blue lights through the trees. I ran toward them like my life depended on it. The deputies listened to what happened, took my statement, and drove me back toward the cabin while keeping me inside the patrol truck. I didn't want to go near that place again, but they needed to clear the scene. When we pulled up, the front door was still hanging open, but the cabin looked empty from the outside. 2 deputies went in. Another stayed with me. After about 5 minutes, one of them called out for the others. Something in his tone made my stomach twist. They found something under the bed. They asked me to step inside, so I could see it myself. I didn't want to, but they insisted. It was important. So I followed them into the bedroom, staying close to the doorway, like the floor itself wasn't safe. One of the deputies knelt and shined his flashlight under the bed. At first I couldn't understand what I was looking at, just a pile of dark fabric, a backpack, and some trash. Then I realized it wasn't trash. It was a stack of food wrappers, water bottles, a small blanket, and a folded piece of paper. The deputy pulled the paper out and handed it to me carefully, like he didn't want to damage it.
My name was written on it.
My full name. It wasn't printed. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in neat, slow letters. Under my name was a date, 5 days earlier, the day before I arrived at the cabin. I felt my chest tighten as I opened it. Inside was a short message. I knew you'd come alone. There was no signature. No clue who wrote it. But the paper wasn't dusty. It wasn't old. Someone had placed it there recently, maybe even earlier that same day, right under the bed I had been sleeping in. The deputies tore through the cabin, checking every inch. That was when they found the second piece of evidence, a small opening in the bedroom closet that led into the crawl space beneath the cabin. Inside it were blankets, a flashlight, a knife, and a few cans of food. The man hadn't been outside watching me. He had been inside the cabin the entire time. Probably during the day. Probably while I was making coffee, studying, or walking around the property. And based on the footprints outside and the disturbance in the crawl space, the deputies said something I'll never forget. He wasn't breaking in tonight. He was coming back. That was the moment everything clicked. The damaged doors, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. The man wasn't trying to get into the cabin. He had been trying to get back to the place he had already been living right under my feet. The police searched the woods for hours that night, but they didn't find him. They brought in a K-9 unit from the next county, combed the trail behind the cabin, checked every shed and empty property along the dirt lane. Nothing. No prints leading away. No abandoned items. No signs that he'd injured himself during the chase. It was like he vanished into the dark the same way he moved through it. Quiet, patient, practiced. By sunrise, the officers told me they were opening an official case, but they didn't have enough to hold me there. They drove me back to town, helped me file a statement, and told me to stay with family for a while. I could barely process anything they were saying. All I kept thinking about was the note, the quiet handwriting, the way my name looked on that paper, like he'd practiced it before writing it. For the next couple of days, I stayed at my parents' place. I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every sound outside, cars passing, dogs barking, felt too close. My mom tried to reassure me. My dad tried to act calm for my sake. But I could see it in their faces. They didn't know how to protect me from someone who had already proven he could be 3 feet away from me without ever being noticed. On the third day, a deputy called. They had found something new. A neighbor farther up the lane reported that someone had tried to pry open his storage shed sometime after I left the area. Same markings, same tool marks, same pattern of footprints. But the part that made every hair on my arm stand up wasn't the break-in attempt. It was the timing. The neighbor said he heard the noise only 20 minutes after the police and I had driven away that night, meaning the man didn't run deeper into the woods. He stayed close. He waited. The deputy told me not to come back to the cabin under any circumstances. My cousin agreed immediately. He didn't even return for his tools. He sent 2 officers to collect them for him. The thought of stepping into that bedroom again made my stomach twist. A few nights after that, something happened that made everything feel worse. I woke up around 3 a.m. at my parents' house, thirsty, and went to the kitchen. While I was standing by the sink, I noticed motion in the backyard, just a faint shift of darkness near the fence line. I thought maybe it was a raccoon. Then the motion sensor light came on. For a split second, I saw a shadow, tall, thin, angled in a way that looked like someone standing still and leaning slightly as if listening. The light stayed on for only a moment before shutting off again. When I stepped closer to the window to look, there was nothing there. In the morning, I checked the yard. The soil near the fence was disturbed. Not deep footprints, just enough to show someone had stood there long enough to shift the... The police came again, searched again, and told me what they always tell people in cases like this. We're doing everything we can. Maybe they are. Maybe they aren't. But here's the part that keeps me awake even now. The cabin's crawl space had food, blankets, and a knife, but it also had something else the deputies didn't tell me until later. A small spiral notebook. Inside were dates,
Times.
notes about movement. Not mine, marks. My cousin's. Which means whoever was living under that cabin didn't start watching me. He had been watching my cousin first. For weeks. Maybe months. And the last page of the notebook had a single line.
He left.
Someone new is coming. The case is still open.
No suspect.
No leads.
No trace.
And every time I wake up at night and feel that quiet pressure in the air, the same heaviness I felt in the cabin, I can't help but wonder. What if he never left the woods at all? What if he just changed where he watches from?